into the action. The first speaker for today is going to be Floris de Lange from the Donders Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, who's gonna tell us about how does our brain use the past to predict the future. Thanks a lot, Floris. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Davide, and thanks Yamil and Davide for inviting me to the conference. I really enjoyed the first day as well. I really learned a lot. So I hope I won't ruin the second day of this exciting symposium with my talk. So I'll give it my best shot. And what I want to do in my talk today is to discuss how the brain uses what it has perceived, what it has experienced in the past, to make predictions about what it will see in the future. Now, as you already saw yesterday, the past contains many statistical regularities, and the brain really likes those. So it automatically learns them and it uses them to anticipate future input. And I will discuss two different types of priors that the brain is sensitive to, and how it uses these priors to optimize processing. Okay. Now, for most of my talk, I'm going to focus on one particular type of prior, which is like stability, the fact that the world tends to be stable over time. It doesn't tend to not change very much. And the answer to the question here, like how does our brain use the past to predict the future, is in case you want to sort of tune out and want to just hear the answer is going to be that it uses the past in two distinct ways. So it doesn't sort of incorporate this prior in one way, but there's like two aspects of processing that are changed by the past. Now, this is something that we do not know because Winston Churchill said it, even though he's raising two fingers here. This is actually something that Matthias Ritje, a postdoc in my lab, has with work I will be showcasing today, concluded. So that's basically the first part of what I'll be talking about today. Now, and as I already told you, the world is an extremely stable place. And one could say that in these COVID times, maybe the world has even become more stable than it already was. Because we tend to be in the same place, in front of our computer, looking at Zoom windows, etc. But even when we were not doing that, even when we were still in the lab, there is, of course, an enormous amount of stability in the world. Typically, when you close your eyes and you open them again, almost everything is the same. There are some things that move around, some things that change, lighting, etc. But grosso modo, things tend to stay quite in the same place. Now, this is sort of an intuition, or it makes sense, but you could, of course, also really try to quantify this. And this is a study that actually did that. So here they just took videos, dynamic videos, either of head-mounted cameras that were head-mounted on cats, or from just some camera that was recording a city scene. And in both cases, you see that there is a huge amount of what you could call autocorrelation in the world. So for example, here you can see that the probability of an orientation change, or the probability of an orientation not changing, in other words, an orientation change of 0, is by far the largest. And that is the case when you look at it over a fairly small temporal scale, like 0.2 seconds. But even for a really extended temporal scale, like 10 seconds, you still see that there is this autocorrelation function involved in these data sets. So in other words, the world is stable. And clearly this is a prior that the brain might exploit to optimize processing. The question that I want to ask here, or that I'm going to address here, is like, how can we exploit this temporal stability? And the answer to that question, or in order to get to the answer, it is, I think, useful to think about perception as an encoding-decoding process. So this is something that I will need to introduce before going to the results, because they will make more sense if you have this framework in the back of your head. So when you think of yourself or your brain as trying to perceive a stimulus, let's say an oriented grading, one can view this process in the following way. So we have a stimulus here that has a certain orientation. And what you could say is that your brain sort of takes a measurement of that stimulus. So clearly we have limited processing capacity. So we cannot represent the stimulus with infinite fidelity. So in other words, there is going to be a measurement of this stimulus that will lead to what you could call a likelihood, sort of like a function that sort of expresses the probability of a particular orientation given the brain pattern. So that's the likelihood. Now you can combine that likelihood with prior knowledge that you may have about, for example, orientations that are more or less likely, etc. So that's over here, the prior knowledge. And if you combine those in a normative way, which is dictated by Bayes' theorem, you will arrive at a posterior. That will basically also be a distribution of of energy across the different orientations. And then by taking a particular rule, like say the map value of this posterior distribution, you can get to an estimate, and you can say like, this is what estimate. Now this step here, that is basically like taking the measurement, is often called the encoding step, whereas this later step here of like inferring what you saw based on both prior knowledge and the input is often referred to as the decoding step. So that's what the terms that I'm going to use in my talk. Now, one way that people have often thought where the stability prior might come in, so the fact that that input tends to be stable over time, is as a form of prior knowledge that could be used during the decoding step. And that would make a lot of sense, right? So if you know that things tend to be stable, that is a source of knowledge that you may use in order to optimize your inference. Okay. Now, sort of in line with that idea, there is the empirical observation by many groups that perceptual decisions tend to be biased towards the recent past. So here is one example of this. This is from a study by David Whitney's lab, which we also replicated. And the observation in this study is extremely straightforward. So what participants did here is they just time and time again saw gradients, and they had to estimate what the orientation of the gradient was. And now what they found was that there was like a systematic bias in people's responses. So if the previous stimulus was a bit oriented a bit clockwise with respect to the current stimulus, then the participants would also make sort of like a systematic error in the direction of the previous stimulus. And they would make an error that would also be in the clockwise direction. Whereas if the previous stimulus was counterclockwise, they would make an error in the counterclockwise direction. So you can sort of capture this in one number, which you can call the bias. You can then see that you obviously get a positive bias for the previous stimulus. You also get a little bit of a bias for 2 trials ago, in this case even 3 trials ago, but you can also see that it declines. So this is a very well reproduced phenomenon that perceptual decisions are biased towards the recent past. Now, this can be understood within the framework of this encoding decoding process that I explained to you at the beginning. Because if you imagine, so I already explained this to you. So we have a trial, you take a measurement that gives rise to a likelihood, and you combine that likelihood with a prior to arrive at a posterior. Now, what is the prior going to be? Well, the prior can be given by history. And if you have this knowledge that things tend to be stable over time, so if in other words, you have a sort of a transition distribution in your mind, that things tend to be the same, and then that like orthogonal orientations are less likely for the current stimulus given the previous stimulus, then if you combine this transition distribution with what you saw in the previous trial, so that your posterior of the previous trial, well, that then can give you a prior that you can combine with your likelihood. And you could do this for your previous trial, but of course you can also do this for 2 trials ago, 3 trials ago, etc. And one thing you might then want to do is also sort of weight these things differently. So you might sort of weight the immediate past quite strongly and weight more distant past less strong. This, in our case, was sort of a free parameter that we use in the model. Now, when we apply this model, so when we try to sort of see whether our behavioral data conform to such a model that uses stability prior, we can see that it actually, that it can approximate the empirical data quite well. So for the empirical data, you get a certain bias that kind of falls off with time. So here you have like the bias for the just preceding trial. This is the bias for 2 trials ago, etc. And it works quite well in this for this recent past. There is, however, a complication, and that is the fact that even though there is kind of an attraction towards the recent past, there's like tons of there's also a lot of data that show that you can actually your perception can be repelled from the more remote history. So this is what I showed you a couple of slides ago. So this is this attraction bias for one trial ago. So that is what is shown here. But if we now map out sort of what not just the previous trial does, but also 2 trials ago, 3 trials ago, etc., all the way up to 40 trials ago, which is of course a ridiculously long time ago in typical experiments, then you can see something quite interesting. So you can see that even though there is an attractive bias for the recent past, this actually fairly quickly flips to becoming a repulsive bias, so a bias against, in the opposite direction, for the more remote past. And what you can see here in the red bars is that, these are sort of significant repulsion effects, that even survive multiple comparison corrections if you would divide it over all these different tests that you would do. So when we first saw this, we were really surprised by this. We didn't really think that this could be possible, that like a trial that you saw like 7 trials ago and maybe almost up to a minute ago could still have an independent, measurable, and also negative effect on your perception of the current trial. So initially we were really surprised by this. But what the data seem to show, and we've now replicated this by 3 or 4 times, is that orientation estimates, so perceptual decisions, are repelled from stimuli that are seen seconds to minutes ago. This has sort of a half-life of about 50 seconds. So after 50 seconds, the effect is half of the maximum. And what's more, this repulsive bias is actually quite spatially specific. So when you, for example, look at the repulsive bias or the bias that the previous trial has on the current trial, you can do this for stimuli that are presented at the same location, or you can do this for stimuli that are presented at a different location. Now, for the attractive bias, that doesn't really matter. It's you can see here the same in a different location are pretty much showing the same profile. But for this repulsive bias, that basically has the opposite shape, there it actually does matter. There you can see that the repulsive bias is actually spatially specific and greatly attenuated when the past was happening in a different location. So when 4 trials ago was on the left and now your study is on the right, you do not see much of a repulsion. Now, the fact that it's spatially, or you might say retinotopically specific, suggests that it might actually be a bias that originates at an earlier sensory stage than this kind of decoding bias that we see for the recent past. Now, maybe just this will maybe not come as a surprise, but the repulsion bias is not well captured by this Bayesian decoding model. So when we look at the Bayesian decoding model, the Bayesian ideal observer that makes use of a stability prior, it can very well capture the bias for the immediate past or the recent past across several experiments, but it completely fails at explaining this repulsive bias that we empirically see, but that should be absent from the point of view of the Bayesian ideal observer. However, there is another way that prior information could be used. And this is not by changing sort of your inference, but actually changing how the sensory information itself is encoded. So in the encoding stage rather than the decoding stage. So as I said in the very beginning, we don't have infinite resources to decode or to encode our stimuli. So our stimuli actually, or our brain obviously has a limited amount of neurons. So there will be a certain precision with which we can encode the outside world. Now there is a normative way of encoding, which is often referred to as efficient encoding, which dictates that you should dedicate most of your encoding resources to the stimuli that are a priori most likely. So therefore, Matthias wondered whether this kind of principle, so the principle of efficient encoding, might also apply in terms of temporal stability. So that when your brain expects to see a certain orientation based on a running average of the past, sort of based on a prediction of the past, then it will also sort of encode most of its, dedicate most of its encoding resources to that orientation. Now, this is something that that Ray and Stocker have applied to a different type of prior, namely sort of the prior that horizontal and vertical orientations are more abundant than oblique orientations. But here we kind of took that logic, but now applied it to a different type of prior, namely the stability prior. So in other words, for efficient encoding, there would be like a transformation of your sensory representation as a function of the prior, of which is formed in exactly the same way as it was formed at the decoding stage. So it's basically sort of like a running average, a weighted running average of your past input. All right, and now the catch there is that when you do something like this, so when you change your encoding along the rules of this kind of efficient code, you will get sort of the highest accuracy for most likely stimulus orientations, because you get sort of the sharpest likelihood, but you'll also get sort of like a long tail away from the peak of the prior. And if you, this might be a little bit abstract if you're not into this. So if you want to know more about that, I can really recommend the Way in Stocker Nature Neuroscience paper, or you can ask me after the talk. But the interesting thing is that this can actually lead to a bias away from the prior peak. So it can lead to, what Way in Stocker referred to as like an anti-Bayesian percept, in other words, sort of like a repulsion away from the prior. Now, and if we combine those two principles, so the principle of, which are both sort of normative principles, basically the best thing that the brain could do, if we apply both of these principles, then you can see that across experiments, the model, so that the Bayesian ideal observer with efficient encoding, which is the bars in green, can actually beautifully capture the empirical data across all these different experiments. And it can account for both the attractive bias to the recent past and the repulsive bias to the more distant past. And it also links them to these different stages, one of which is more retinotopic than the other. Now, interestingly, we can also look at the integration weights here. So in other words, how much of the past is actually used. And we kept this as a free parameter for the two different stages. And what we found quite peculiar is that at the encoding stage, the model actually uses quite a lot of data. So the half-life here is 30 seconds, meaning that the model uses data of uses data of up to like a minute, let's say, in the past to kind of form its prior that is used for efficient encoding. Now, so to wrap this part up, the observers seem to use the stability prior in two different ways. So one of them is efficient encoding, where the goal is to improve the sensory representation. And maybe I should say that this goal will generally be met in a world that has temporal autocorrelation. But in our experiment, where there is actually zero autocorrelation, or in other words, there's like a uniform probability distribution, so any orientation is equally likely to be followed by any other orientation. Of course, it's actually not very adaptive. So it's adaptive in a normal world that actually has orientation autocorrelation. So, and this then results in a repulsion away from previous sensations, with a very long half-life. And the other way then is what I could call like Bayesian decoding, where the goal is not so much to improve the sensory representation, but rather to improve the decision. And that actually results in an attraction towards previous internal representations. And we find that prior is actually more quickly decaying. In other words, or it uses a more limited window of the past than the encoding step. And one thing that we found really surprising and interesting here is this fact that the encoding stage, which we typically view as something that is happening in low-level sensory areas, it's not very cognitive, should not be too much influenced by cognitive or history factors, that we find such a strong and long-lasting effect of the past. because when we first saw these data, or when we saw the data of the first experiment, both Matthias and I were a bit skeptical. We thought, like, how is it possible that your brain keeps sort of like a memory of a stimulus that it has seen a minute ago with many, many intervening stimuli, and without you needing to memorize them? That really didn't sit right with us. But maybe sort of like a metaphor that might help to make sense of why this still could be happening is sort of the metaphor of footsteps on the beach. So if you are sort of like if you see each stimulus basically as like leaving one imprint on your sensory cortex that kind of like lingers on and only slowly decays, well, then you might actually sort of see that every new stimulus is kind of arriving on that sort of complex blanket of previous impressions of all the stimuli that the brain has seen in the past. So, but yeah, clearly this is just a metaphor, and it doesn't make it any more true. So our question then was like, is there actually any neurophysiological evidence that events that happened many seconds ago can affect the encoding stage in early visual cortex? Now, we didn't think that we could get much traction on this question in humans, given that, yeah, the non-invasive measurement techniques there don't make it such an ideal, make it very difficult to answer this question. But of course, so for this question, Matthias turned to the mouse, and there is an amazing resource provided by the Allen Institute for Brain Science that has basically lots of openly available data, both in terms of structure, but also in terms of function. So in terms of like brain recordings from the mouse. And the data sets that Matthias was particularly interested in here is a visual coding data set that was recorded with neuropixels. So neuropixels are a certain type of probe that that have many contact points. They're a fairly recent invention, and are rather amazing, because by inserting quite a few of these probes into your mouse brain, you can get like many concurrent recordings from many different areas. So here you can see sort of a table of all the areas in the visual cortex, hippocampus, thalamus, and midbrain that are concurrently recorded while mice do all kinds of things like natural movies, etc. So what we were looking at is like the visual cortex and the thalamus, and particularly during drifting and static rating. So those were the two data sets that were interesting for us, especially because also here there was no structure in the actual experiment. So there was like a uniform probability distribution, and that allowed us to look at kind of like this default prior that the brain might have in terms of like how is the stimulus, or what is the visual response elicited by a stimulus depending on what happens in the distant and more, or in the close by past and a more distant past. All right, so the first data set that Matthias looked at was this. So we have just like a stimulus for 2 seconds, that is in this case also a drifting grading, then at 1 second blank, then another one, etc. So there's like quite a lot of orientations, I think 8 different orientations here. And what we're going to look at is, of course, repeats. So where you have the stimulus that is the same compared to the stimulus where it's not the same. All right, and well, clearly when you repeat a stimulus, you get something that is called as adaptation or repetition suppression. And adaptation is basically what you could call the neural counterpart of perceptual repulsion. Right? So the fact that when you see a stimulus, or when you have a stimulus and then you have another stimulus that is a little bit a different orientation. So the reason why your estimate of your current stimulus might be sort of repelled away from the past could be because of this phenomenon. So the phenomenon of adaptation, that your brain is basically adapted to the stimulus from the past. Now, this is of course no news. You just get adaptation for repeated stimuli. But what is news, and this hasn't really been described so much in the literature of animals, surprisingly enough, is that this adaptation effect is actually extremely long-lasting as well. So this is in mice, so it's a different species, of course. It's also in mice that are not doing any tasks; they're just kind of passively bombarded with the stimuli. So clearly, you get, of course, the strongest adaptation for the stimuli that you just saw. But you get reliable adaptation for stimuli up to like 8 stimuli ago, which is about 22 seconds ago. So here, when you estimate the half-life of this exponential, it's about 14 seconds. And you might think like, well, yeah, okay, but this is really quite small. But clearly, of course, the individual contribution of each stimulus is small. But when you would add all of this up, they would actually outweigh even the adaptation by the just preceding stimulus. So there is like really a strong effect, of the combined task, so to speak. And this long-term adaptation was basically present in all cortical areas in the visual system that we looked at, but it was not present in the thalamus. So this really seems to be a cortical phenomenon. In the thalamus, you do have adaptation for the previous stimulus, but then it kind of jumped pretty much back to an adaptation rate of 1, meaning no adaptation. Whereas for the cortex, it was surprisingly long. So this suggests that this is kind of like a cortical phenomenon, where maybe the cortex indeed, probably by means of synaptic plasticity, keeps sort of a long-term average of your past stimulation. Okay, and we also replicated it in the other data set. So in other words, this is again a very reproducible phenomenon. All right. So the interim summary then is that human observers exploit temporal stability of the environment in 2 distinct ways. So that's hence the 2. So one is the efficient encoding of visual input, and that seems to be linked to adaptation in sensory circuits, or at least there's like a plausible link there with the adaptation time course in sensory cortex. And the other way in which temporal stability is used is at sort of like the decoding or decision stage of the perceptual process, where you are attracting sort of your estimates to the more recent past. And this might be happening more in working memory, we think, rather than in sensory circuits. Okay, do we have another like 5 to 10 minutes, maybe?
I think you got another 5 minutes, Floris.
Okay, now I think that's all I need. Thanks. Yeah. Then I'll be able to also cover my sort of second part of the talk, because, well, what I think I try to convince you of is that temporal stability is a powerful regularity in our visual world, and the brain is massively impacted by it. But clearly, it's not the only one, and I think you might also say it's maybe the most boring one, right? Because it's really like just the fact that things tend to be the same. And this is probably indeed something that the brain uses, but it's not the only thing that we can use. We can use much more sophisticated models and capitalize on much more sophisticated forms of regularity. And one of them is, for example, the fact that objects tend to move in predictable ways, but it can also be even much more abstract. So the fact that our world is full of predictable sequences in language, in vision, etc. And these sort of more sophisticated forms of statistical regularity is what I would like to focus on in my second part. And the question here is like, how or does, in general, the visual system capitalize on these kind of more sophisticated forms of predictability? One scenario where you would not want to use your stability prior is if you are playing a game of tennis against Roger Federer, let's say. So clearly, when you're the opponent, and you see sort of Roger Federer like making this serve, if you're going to assume that the world is stable and things are probably going to be as they were in the past, then you're not going to win this game. So rather, what you should do is, of course, in this case, sort of anticipate sort of the trajectory of objects over time to anticipate the location of the ball and return the serve. Now, this is a phenomenon that is in the world of in the hippocampus-minded researchers is sometimes called forward replay. So we know from the hippocampus that there are like place cells where like different cells encode for different positions. And interestingly, there is a phenomenon that hippocampus researchers have discovered already a while ago, which is sometimes called forward replay, which is the phenomenon that when a rat is not moving, but just often sort of at the beginning of a journey, before he's moving, that you also see sort of like an activity of the locations that the rat is likely to visit, and sort of like upcoming anticipated locations. So this is what you could call sort of like an encoding of the anticipation of sequential positions of the animal, suggesting sort of a predictive code in the hippocampus. And interestingly, something similar has been suggested to take place even in the sensory systems, in visual systems. So here is a study from the group of Vidal, where they trained rats to look at basically a ball that was moving across the screen. And then after that, they saw sometimes these kind of sequences of activity, but now in the visual system, as if in anticipation of such a sequential movement of the ball. And this is something that Matthias Ekman was intrigued by, a postdoc in the lab, and he wanted to know whether there is indeed some evidence for this kind of forward replay, or which we also call pre-play, of anticipated visual stimulation in your primary visual cortex. And the way he did that is by sampling sort of like a narrow piece of the visual cortex, and then most of the time presenting subjects with moving dot sequences, maybe you saw it, like there's this dot flashing from left to right, and then occasionally presenting people with just a starting point to see whether their visual system would sort of automatically represent anticipated locations of future interest. So that was more or less the design. And then what we find is when we look at the bolt activity across sort of like the visual field. So this here is like a bold activity map where the color, the hot colors indicate activity. But now sort of given that your visual cortex has a retinotopic map of the visual world, you can then sort of transform your visual activity from a brain space into this kind of stimulus space. So in activity in stimulus space, of course, you get activity for the 4 locations that were stimulated when you have a moving dot sequence. But interestingly, you see also that when you flash the starting point, there is activity here, but also at some of these sort of future locations, which seems to kind of die out towards the end. And clearly you don't have anything like that when you're just flashing the endpoint. So when you don't have this kind of pre-play activity. So this already is a first suggestion, I think, that the visual system is indeed kind of in the business of sort of anticipating future stimulation. But a somewhat sort of more interesting a more interesting way to think about these results is that your visual system, so that the population activity in your visual system might be sort of akin to what is often what is referred to as the successor representation. And that phenomenon again, or that representation comes again from hippocampal research, where people have hypothesized that the hippocampal code is sort of like a weighted representation of your present state, as well as like future expected states that you might encounter. So if you're a rat and you're sitting in one location and you can only go one location, you can only go in one particular direction, then you will sort of the population activity of your hippocampus will also sort of encode where you are, but also sort of to some extent where you are likely to go to be in the future. So this is this so-called successor representation. And in the last study that I will very quickly go through, we tried to get more direct evidence for this idea, so that your visual population activity might represent a successor representation. Now, and this again is work by Matthias together with an internship student, Sarah Kush. And what he did is he gave people sort of arbitrary sequences of 4 dots. So there was not motion anymore, but just like a dot that was maybe first here, then there, then there, then there. And he trained these sequences repeatedly over an extensive amount of time. Well, you could also have different sequences, so different subjects have different sequences. There's also a certain task, but I'll skip over that. And I'll just go straight to the beef, which is that, well, of course, when you present this sequence, so when you present all the 4 dots, then you get activity in all those 4 dot locations. Here now you have the bold activity, so neural activity in the primary visual cortex for those 4 locations. There's of course no surprises here. You just have, you show 4 dots, you get 4 activity. for activated regions. The interesting thing is, like first let's again sort of compare the situation where you just present the first dot or you just present the last dot of that sequence. And here again, you see that when we just present this first dot, so A, of course you get activity in dot 1, but you also get some activity in these other dots. It seems to kind of decline, so it's like dot 2, dot 3, dot 4. And that is not the case when you present just this fourth dot. So when you present the dot that is not associated with any kind of future states. So clearly dot A is sort of leads to anticipation of dot 2, 3, and 4. Now this is fairly spatially selective, but then yeah, we can also look at these other locations. So what would happen if you activate the second dot or the third dot? And here you can see again, if you activate or if you stimulate the second dot, you see some activity in dot 3 and not so much in dot 4 anymore, but you do not see activity in dot 1. And again, if you present dot 3, you see some activity in dot 4, but not in dot 1 and dot 2. So there's really this kind of forward-looking population activity, whereas a stimulus, when you, yeah, obviously you get the strongest activity for the stimulus that was sort of bottom-up input to the system, but you see for the rest that there's this kind of interesting sort of temporarily discounted activity of successor states rather than predecessor states. All right, so that's it. So let me summarize the three take-home messages. So the first one is that observers use stability in two and both normative ways. So they use stability to influence their efficient encoding, and they use it for optimal Bayesian decoding of input. And we find that both behavior but also sensory activity in the visual system actually contains a running average of past exposure, also further linking the efficient encoding to population activity in the sensory system. And finally, we find that for sort of more complex future trajectories, that your sensory activity actually represent the temporally discounted expected future states. So in other words, so when you're here but you're expecting to go there, then your visual system is representing both the here but also sort of already a little bit the future states, so where you are about to go. All right, and with that, I'm going to end my talk and particularly thank Matthias Fritschen, who has worked on the stability and biases by the past, and Matthias Ekman, who has worked a lot on the successor representation of the second part. Okay, that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Floris. Thank you. Very, very interesting and stimulating talk. Right, so we got time for questions now. Let's start with one of our attendees, Peter Koch, who's now allowed to talk.
Hi, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent.
Hi.
Hi, Floris. Great talk. The latest study you present, I hadn't heard about yet. That's really cool. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on where these sequences, these predictive sequences, might be stored or learned, and specifically, do you see anything in a hippocampus in this study?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so we this is really work in progress so far. So we haven't really looked extensively at the hippocampus, but it will indeed be sort of one of our primary suspects. Because I agree that for these kind of sort of arbitrary sequences that that are not sort of like stored by sort of primitives of motion, let's say, the hippocampus would make a lot of sense. I think in a study that we did earlier, sort of with the moving dots, there I think it's still quite possible that the prior is just formed by sort of like simple motion extrapolation, right? So that simply just expects things, or when you repeatedly see a ball moving from the left to the right, that you get this kind of automatic motion predictions. But in this case, it might be given that it's just a ball jumping across the window or jumping across the screen. Sorry. I think the hippocampus would be a very plausible candidate. Absolutely.
Great, thanks. Yeah, because indeed the left to right sweep, indeed, I can imagine that V5 may do a lot of that work, but in this case, yeah. Well, I'm curious what you'll find. Really cool study. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question.
Good. So we got a question in the question and answer. Gonna read that aloud for Luis Mochizuki. I have a basic question. New to the field, can I assume that these two efficient ways to use past for the future supports the idea of reafference and efferent copy?
Okay, let's see if I got this question. So whether the efficient coding idea is in line with the idea of efference copy or efferent coding. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think that the emphasis is more on these two different way of using the past, two different, so the idea of optimal encoding and optimal decoding.
Yeah, yeah.
Be connected to that.
Yeah, I have to think about that more. I mean, I'm familiar with the efference copy with quite a different literature, namely sort of like the copy that you would create when you produce, for example, an action that would sort of lead to a prediction about the sensory consequences of that action. But this is a less, you could say that the model is employed here is a bit simpler. It's basically just a model that assumes that whatever I'm seeing now is going to be what I'm seeing in the future. Or whatever I saw in the past is what I'm going to see in the present. So that is not linked in a very direct way with, with the more sophisticated predictions that you would make with an efference copy, because there it would really be linked specifically to something you do, or like say, like if you move your eyes to a certain location, you are expecting a very specific type of sensory inputs to occur. So in that sense, I think, yeah, maybe at a very high level, there might be a link, but I don't think there's a direct link.
Thank you, Floris. There is Tristan with his hand raised. Tristan, go ahead.
Hi, Floris. I mean, always great to see you present stuff, and allows me to integrate a lot of ideas in a clever manner. Also, excellent use of the available data of the alien, right? I mean, this is exactly what it's for. I have sort of a high flyer question that you probably have discussed in the lab or with other people, which is related to the idea that, I mean, you sort of hinted that this repulsion aspect, or the way of modeling this sort of, attraction repulsion, seems to be working for perceptual, aspects, decisions that seems to be related to local, but not thalamic. And I was wondering whether you have thought of extending this. I know, you presented the hippocampus, but afterwards, beyond that, to abstract things, something that you could sort of model things like a stop signal task or a reversal learning task, where, of course, where the perceptual aspect is less important and tracking of the information across trials is important. So how, in short, how this relates to the ideas of evidence accumulation?
Yeah, super interesting questions. Yeah, I think there's lots of questions there, actually. But you're absolutely right. I think this is kind of just scratching the surface and sort of like the sensory part of it. And there have been really interesting work, for example, by Charles Broder's lab, Athena Akrami, who looked also at biases in sort of more later stages of like where maybe the evidence is being accumulated rather than encoded, where you actually tend to see these kind of positive biases across trials, and trying to sort of mechanistically see how those kind of biases arise. So there is definitely some work out there on that. Whether we will be able to look at this within, I mean, the Allen Institute data that we were able to get our hands on is completely devoid of any decision making. So that there it's just like a mouse is just looking at stuff, or is probably not even looking. He's just kind of being bombarded with sensation. So I think it will be indeed very interesting to see how this will interact with the rest of the brain in more complicated tasks, like what you are, the type of task you're referring to. So for now, yeah, this is just the beginning, and I think there are new data sets that will come out also where there is behavior, where maybe we will be able to look at more interesting aspects also related to the decoding stage. Thanks.